tell us a bit about your early years as a high school kid and then going to college. What inspired you to pursue a career in law?
So I don't think it was necessarily the first option, as a lot of people that become, let's say, lawyers say, okay, I wanted to be a lawyer for a long time or since I was a high school kid. It was not like that for me. When I got into law school, it was more about the logic I found behind understanding how rules function and how you would be able to use them to build different things or to help others build different things. And after I graduated, I started looking a little bit around and understanding, okay, where's the best position in which I can help others solve their needs and help them understand how they can apply the rules which I learned about for their specific needs. There weren't a lot of, let's say, law firms that were doing anything other than, let's say, traditional business law. I had the luck to find that kind of a law firm. And that's where I got in touch with technology companies, the way an entrepreneur works, the way founders structure their mind and their ideas in order to be able to, again, solve the needs of their end clients and users. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. So that's fast forward how I got into this area of law and specifically technology.
I was going to ask you when did the lawyer meet the tech industry and what inspired you to pursue this kind of career, this kind of path?
It was again by accident. I mean, I wasn't necessarily sure that I wanted to pursue something related to technology. Back then, it was more about, let's say, intellectual property, but that was pretty broad because you can find intellectual property in all sorts of companies, not only technology ones. But once I started looking at different law firms where I could start working after I graduated and got admitted to the Romanian bar, I started to look for law firms that were also trying to use their position as an, let's say, facilitator for all sorts of transactions and all sorts of needs to maybe come with something new and also build something other than just the standard way of providing legal services. That's when I got into touch with the Venture Connect initiative. And I got that opportunity to, apart from working as a lawyer, also understand how a startup event, a pitching event happens. There weren't a lot of events of pitching events at that moment. So I think it was kind of accidental. I knew I was looking to do something more than just being a lawyer. That turned out to be working with technology companies.
Tell us a bit about that period. You've worked alongside Ana Maria Andronic and the Venture Connect team for a couple of years, 2 years, maybe. Almost
so
three.
it was 2013 to 2015. I think Venture Connect got started 2009 or 2010, if I'm not mistaken. And I got invited by Ana Maria to a specific Venture Connect event before starting to work together. And I think it was pretty fascinating to see, first of all, a room of people that were there to see others talk about their business. I don't think I had the concept of pitching back then. They were presenting their business. There was a panel of experts that was evaluating their presentations, and they were asking questions about their businesses. And I think it was pretty fascinating to see that this was all in the context of a law firm organizing this, because in hindsight, it kind of makes sense because you're at the forefront of different deals happening, but actually moving into arena and providing this kind of a platform for this matchmaking between what was then a very nascent ecosystem of startups and of companies in the IT sector building proprietary technology and people who were interested in investing, advising, or working with those companies was quite interesting. And I think that's what hooked me to continue working with Ana Maria in those first years.
At that point, did you know something about startups and this ecosystem founders and how to work as a lawyer with startup founders?
I had no connection specifically to this area. I wasn't aware of any kind of other events or players in the field. Okay, maybe I had heard a couple of interviews with Radu Georgescu or let's say other more prominent figures in the space, but there weren't that many. So I don't think I had this insight into what a startup is. And I remember right in my first year when I started working as a lawyer, I also took part in a startup weekend event. And that was, it was a totally different ball game. There were people from all areas with different types of expertise, and they got together for a weekend and started working on different ideas. There were also some more experienced entrepreneurs there who were providing mentoring. And for me, it was a really new experience. So back in 2013, I don't think that those were exactly my first experiences of learning what a startup is and how it works.
Tell us a bit about those 2 years. I guess that was a point when you started seeing more startups and actually working with some of them, maybe before your time with How to Web and those events 10 years ago. What did they know about the legal aspects of running a business, a tech business in Romania?
So what I remember quite vividly is most of the clients that came to the law firm, which I was a part of, were already kind of mature. You didn't see very early stage entrepreneurs coming for legal advice. I don't know exactly, I couldn't specify the reason for which that happened. I can only assume it's again this idea that you're only going to a lawyer when you have the relevant resources, especially financially, to do that. But there were an entry point was usually a transaction, and you had more mature either services companies or even product companies. But back then, I think it was mostly services companies that were at a stage where they either needed to do an exit. If we were on the product side, I think it was mostly about websites that had a lot of traction and that had attracted interest from the investors back then. So again, it wasn't a lot of proprietary technology involved. But it was more about really experienced founders. And if I remember correctly, there was also a context at I think a Venture Connect event where I interacted for the first time with Malin Ștefănescu. And I think he probably is my first image of an entrepreneur in that space, right before starting to do investments, but working on his specific company, his specific services company. But I think that was basically the image. Mature companies, especially in the services space, that had issues related to transactions, sometimes agreements, but mostly related to transactions. There weren't a lot of early stage companies.
And this brings us to your time as a startups community manager for How to Web and the programs, Spotlight program, MVP Academy, and those kind of programs that and competitions that were part of the whole How to Web ecosystem and TechHub ecosystem. How did you see founders and startups and the ecosystem at that point evolve from there, up to that point and from there on?
So the moment where I moved for a couple of years to just being a lawyer out of curiosity into a community management position, was the moment when I think there were the region, the ecosystem in the region, so not only Romania, but also what was happening around Romania, started to take shape in my mind. And the idea that, okay, there are a lot of countries, it's not only about Romania, maybe the region as a whole needs to have a springboard of opportunities. And I saw that through working with the startups that, as you mentioned, came through the Spotlight program during How to Web, through the MVP Academy Pre-Accelerator. And I think what I've seen from an, let's say, an evolutionary perspective is, back then there were a lot of familiar faces which you asked for help in building any kind of new program or the next edition of the same program. So I remember that in the 2 or 3 years when I was a part of the startup Spotlight team, we always started from 10 to 20 people who were from Western Europe, from the UK, from France, who were really, really keen on coming here and giving a helping hand. And they said yes from the start. And that allowed you to bring an additional group of people who were maybe newer to the ecosystem. So a lot of it was incremental back then. If I look at it 7 or 8 years to the present day, I think it's much easier to bring in new faces in mentorship positions. So in those, let's say, operational roles that you need when you're building a conference, a competition, an incubator, an accelerator. So I think that that's one part of the testament that the ecosystem is growing, because you see different new faces each year for each program in that operational phase, coming there to give a helping hand to everybody in the community.
Do you remember what you've noticed about the founders that went through all those programs while you were actually involved in the ecosystem, not just as a lawyer, but working for these programs? And also for Venture Connect, the entire experience, those years.
So I think, first of all, a lot of the companies and a lot of the founders that were coming through these programs, and they were, let's say, in a batch of MVP Academy, or in 1 year of Spotlight, or in a specific iteration of Venture Connect, a lot of them were founders that ended up building businesses that are either still active now, which I think is a great thing to have, companies which have seen the entire decade as living organisms, but also founders that, even if they weren't necessarily successful with that specific business, they've remained a part of the ecosystem one way or the other. And I think that shows that the people who were involved at the beginning and the founders were really, really the right ones to be there at the beginning. Once the ecosystem started to grow, the funnel started to grow a lot bigger. So I think you see more people coming in, and you see different faces in acceleration or incubation programs. If you look at the calendar of a year, you're going to see the same founders roughly coming in all the iterations of the acceleration or incubation programs of that year. But next year, you're probably going to see a different batch, so newer faces. And I think that's probably natural for any kind of startup ecosystem, where you see a lot of people coming in and only the ones who are really resilient stick there. And I think it's part of the evolution. At the beginning, you had really high quality. Everybody who came in actually was there because they wanted to build a business. Now, with the bigger funnel, you have this avenue of experimenting, of going through these programs, understanding if building a startup is the relevant thing for you or not. And I think that's great. So I think this is an important difference in the types of founders that we have in the ecosystem and in all of those programs.
Still talking about the programs for startups, for founders. How do you think that these kinds of competitions and programs helped Romanian founders get to this point in time? And put them into contact with investors from outside, with other partners or clients and stuff like this?
I think it's all about exposure, right? I mean, when you're building something which has a degree of innovation, but you're also building it in a region which doesn't have a lot of investors or access to corporate partners that are interested in partnering with startups, having these types of structured events help you get exposure in a very condensed period of time to relevant experts, to investors, which might not be the right fit for you at that moment in time. But since you're coming from a region which is emerging in this area, it takes time to build those relationships and those connections. And the investor you're meeting today might not be ready, or you might not be ready to invest right now, to get an investment from them. But it's a process, and that exposure allows you to create those connections and again create that funnel from the perspective of the people relevant for your business in order to be able to filter out. And I think that's a process that it would be very difficult to replicate on your own, just using LinkedIn or all the social media networks to try to connect with everybody. You still need that warm context where you as a startup being part of the program means you've been vetted to some extent by the organizers and by other organizations, and that creates a level of trust that allows you to get in touch with those investors. And when they come to a specific event, when they come to give mentorship to the startups in the event, I think that means that they're interested in giving something to the ecosystem. And if you're there, then that might be a great match. But I think it's all about the exposure, which would be complicated to get if you didn't have this structured approach to things that these programs provide.
How are you mixing the lawyer part, the lawyer part with your experience working with startups and with founders? How at this point in time in your career?
So after that period of time working as a startup community manager, I also had a period of time working in the fintech space, and I had the opportunity to be at the start of the Romanian Fintech Association, which is now quite a representative organization for this vertical of innovation. And I realized that there's this mismatch between how a founder or how a manager of a startup or even an SME thinks about legal issues and what's available on the market. And I'm not talking only about legal services, because for legal issues you can have different solutions. Software is starting to penetrate this idea of this area of legal services and creating different types of solutions. And this connection between being close and liking the ecosystem and wanting to be as close as possible to where these ideas start building and the programs that we mentioned. I think that's what got me into thinking about how we as lawyers and how we could build a team to support the founders and the managers in this process. And if I look at the past 5 or 6 years since we started doing this, working specifically with technology companies, I think there are some things that haven't changed. There are some things that have. I see an improvement on the part of the founders. I see that they're more willing to admit when they have a legal issue, because luckily we have a lot of resources in the ecosystem, in the accelerators, in the incubators, from legal professionals, which come in and do one-on-ones or do all sorts of sessions for the founders that take part in those programs. What I don't see changed is a founder's understanding that legal is something that around which you can create a framework, if you want an operating system for your business. And the earlier you try to understand the legal issues you might run into, the better it will be for you as a company or for you as an individual when those legal issues arise. If things go right, legal issues will arise. I mean, we were talking about the transactions that were happening for the most successful entrepreneurs. That's what everybody wants. That a transaction is a legal issue that you need to take care of. So I think it's quite natural to mix startups and startup building with the legal framework around it, because I think they're inevitable. I mean, for any successful business, and all founders want to build successful business, legal is a part of it. So they're they're a pretty good match from my perspective.
You've kind of anticipated my next question. I was going to ask you, how do you see the evolution of Romanian startup founders from a lawyer's perspective, and if they've changed during these years, and if working with partners or clients from outside Romania changed their ways, their legal ways, and if they're more inclined to preserve their intellectual property also, because it's also a huge deal, I think, in working in IT, in tech, to preserve what you're doing.
It's also worth noting that since the Romanian ecosystem has become a little more known in the western part of the world, especially thanks to stories like UiPath's one, I think also the clients which are being targeted by Romanian solutions have a different understanding about the startup or their founder they're talking about. And that is seen specifically in contracts which are being negotiated with the client. And if your client puts a pressure on you to create a contract that makes sense for them, ultimately it's going to reverberate to you as a founder, and you're going to try to use at least time to understand which kind of agreement you need to sign with your client. So I think it's that external pressure of performing well with your client that has led some founders and managers to employ more resources, specifically in the area of time, to get those legal issues solved. There's another thing which I've seen for some of the most successful companies that I've worked with in the past years, and that's they almost always have someone in the founding team that is hands-on on the legal issues. And I'm talking about things from when they need to renew some kind of permit, or they need to renew the agreement for their working point or for their office space, to more, let's say, hands-on things like signing agreements with clients, creating templates, creating a working procedure with their clients, and so on and so forth. And I've seen that direct correlation. Whenever someone is on top of that, part of the founding team, that startup has a different chance of surviving and of actually thriving than startups which where the legal aspect is fully externalized to a provider. And moving on the intellectual property side, which, as you mentioned, is really, really important. It's really important, again, in the first, let's say, 1 or 2 years of actually building a business, where you don't have a lot of numbers to show. And the only way in which you can convince your client that you're the right fit for them, or you can convince an investor that their investment is safe with your company, is by consolidating intellectual property. I would say, since intellectual property is quite a technical area of law, I wouldn't say it's something that founders get better than they did 6 or 7 years ago, but they know that it's something relevant for their business. So it's a good starting point. So I think it's a process, right? You can't get from A to Z in just a generation time of entrepreneurs. It takes a little bit longer. So I think it's something iterative. It's something that we as legal services or legal solutions providers have to work on. It's this idea of a little bit educating people and founders and managers about these needs and how they can be solved.
Since when did you start to see this shift, or like you said, that someone in the founding team is more hands-on when it comes to legal aspects? And is it something relatable just to startups that got investments and, let's say, large investments from venture capital, or is it something that it's beginning to come more natural to startup founders in Romania? They've reached a certain level of sophistication where they understand that that legal is also important for their business.
I don't see necessarily an evolution. Let's say I see 10% or 20% more founders which are inclined to solve the legal issues. So that would be one thing. I don't see, it's something which is not necessarily, we still have to cover the basics. I mean, not everybody fits the mold which I've just described. But what I've seen in practice is that one thing that makes founders create a good business, if we're talking about product companies, if we're talking about services companies, is using a little bit of the experience and know-how from their peers in the industry. Founders usually know other founders and they have support groups or they have a shoulder to cry on whenever needed. So they also use that support group when needing to understand how to structure their business or solve their legal issues. So I see a lot of founders doing that because they know from their founders, from their peer founders, that there are some solutions that need to be employed in different situations. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily related to investment. I mean, when you're in the process of raising an investment, that's an external pressure on you to get your house in order. And that's when usually a lot of companies do that. But getting compliant is not, it's not something, you can get compliant in one specific time. And if your business evolves, the way in which you're compliant 1 year or 2 years ago is still relevant. It's a constant process, and that moves us back to the idea of having someone in your team who's on top of those things. What I can say about startups that have raised investment is when they worked with us on getting their legal documents in order and understanding their transaction documents. Again, it's a direct correlation between the success and autonomy of a startup and how much time they've spent with us or with another lawyer to understand the transaction documents and to have a walkthrough through the documents. And that's really relevant because if you're going down that path of raising funding, it's probably not going to be just one funding round. It's going to be multiple ones. So the way in which you understand the basics when you start off is what is going to allow you to be a better negotiator for the next rounds, with or without a lawyer. What I always like to say to founders is it's okay to have legal support when you're raising investment. It's okay to not have legal support. But even if you have legal support, it's up to you to understand what you're signing, because at the end of the day, a legal advisor or any kind of advisor is just that, an advisor. You're the one who has to live with the consequences, good or bad, of what you're signing. And especially on the investment front, it's really relevant to understand what you're signing, because that sets you on a path or another path for 5, 7, 10 years if things go okay.
From your perspective, what's still lacking, or what are the challenges related to these bureaucratic aspects of doing business in tech in Romania, of growing a startup? What do you think that is still lacking in Romania from a judiciary point of view, if there's something lacking or if there are challenges?
I think there aren't enough legal solutions or enough pieces of legislation that are directly targeted or directly arising from problems of startups. I would say a lot of the things that help you start a business in Romania have been simplified over the years, and that's a good thing. But a business is not necessarily the same as a startup. You can have a lot of businesses. Startups are pretty specific. And it also got me thinking through the years why we don't have these pieces of legislation that specifically target startups, or not specifically, but you understand that the context in which they've been done is to facilitate this kind of a business. And I think it's also, again, a question of applying pressure and having consistency, because, for instance, I don't expect someone in the Romanian parliament or in a Romanian ministry to have this initiative of drafting an order, a ministry order, or a new law that specifically targets this area. There have been, of course, initiatives, but I don't think that's my expectation. I don't think it's reasonable to think that someone who goes there with a specific agenda can have a really good understanding of this area, unless they're coming from this area, or unless they've been a founder or an entrepreneur that has built a business in this area, had some struggles, and decided to go in the political arena to solve it for the other people. And by the way, that would be a good thing to happen. But what I think can happen from the ecosystem towards the authority is a sort of pressure, and consistent pressure, to get different solutions. But in order to create that pressure, we need a little bit more collaboration in the ecosystem. Now that we know among ourselves who is active, who is really passionate about this area, who has been building programs, education programs, incubator, accelerators, conference throughout the years, I think we need to do a better job of banding together and applying that pressure. And that would help us to have different initiatives, like different classes of shares in companies, in limited liability companies. We had a legal initiative on that. I don't think it got enough attention from the ecosystem in order to put pressure on the authorities to get it through. And sadly, I think it withered away. So I would say, to sum up, that there's a lot of simplification in the bureaucracy needed to start a company in Romania, which is good, because a lot of startups start as just your average company. I don't think there are a lot of solutions for startups that want to have that trajectory of high growth and the venture capital funding that takes place really easily. But I think that can change if there's more pressure and more constant pressure from the ecosystem to have that, to say, okay, we need solutions to these issues. We also have some ideas about the solutions. we want to be heard, we want to talk with you, and we're going to stay here as long as it takes in order to get this through.
What differences do you see in the way we do things legally here, as compared to what's happening in more evolved ecosystems in Europe? I'm not even talking about the US, but we have examples of Romanian businesses, tech businesses that are now incorporated in other countries and also in the States. Which are the differences, and why is it better at some point in your evolution as a tech business maybe to move things outside?
I think before we think about the legal framework, which in a lot of conversations is mentioned by founders, even by investors, as being an obstacle to have more startups that are started locally stick here for a longer period of time. I think we also need to understand a little bit about the dynamics of building a startup. Again, we're an emerging ecosystem. There aren't a lot of opportunities for growth, especially if we're talking not only Romania, but in the European Union. The European Union is a set of very fragmented markets. Okay, we have this aim of having standard procedures and standard laws that apply to all the member states, but it's a vision, not necessarily a reality. So you have, for one, a lot of different markets with different cultures, with different expectations, where clients work differently. So it's quite complicated to expand in other countries. If you're starting from Romania, but also if you're starting from another country in the region. I'm thinking everything from the Central Eastern Europe fits into that category. Moving to the fact that we don't have a lot of investors because we're still an emerging ecosystem, that leads to the idea that if you know that ultimately your plan is to target users or clients from the US, that means that you need a presence there. That means that you could exponentially raise more money from the US than you could do locally. So I think all of these things combined are the ones that lead a founder to decide, okay, maybe I can skip a few stages and go to the US directly after my first investment round, because there's more money there. My end clients for which I'm building this product are not here in Romania or in the region or Europe, are in the US. So I think it's about the ease or the dimension of the market. However, I've seen this structure happening quite a few times where you keep at least the R&D part in Romania. So the intellectual property actually gets built locally. Maybe it gets transferred or licensed to a mother company in Western Europe or in the US, which then has the connection with the clients. Or you have different types of organizations that serve different types of clients. You have a Romanian entity that works with the European companies for GDPR reasons. You have a US company that works with the US and Australia because there are similarities in how things work. But by far and large, that's why companies go there. It's more from a business perspective, not necessarily a legal challenge. And I think this is something that founders locally should be aware of. There aren't a lot of legal challenges to start and build a startup locally in your first few years, and probably that would be the most efficient way of doing things. However, then depending on the market you're targeting, you have all sorts of dynamics that may lead you to the decision to move in Western Europe or the US. So it's more about the business, not the legal side.
Taking into consideration everything that you've experienced during, it's roughly 10 years of being involved in the startup ecosystem in Romania in different roles and with different perspectives. Where do you think that we're heading, let's say, again, in the next 5 to 10 years?
I hope we're aiming towards more collaboration and also to more openness of the ecosystem, more attraction on behalf of the ecosystem to people outside of the ecosystem. And I'll start with the first part. For a market which is not only emerging but also quite small, which is the case for Romania, I think it's really important to have all these positive forces get together regularly in different types of organizations or in different types of contexts to work together on initiatives which are relevant for the ecosystem. In the startup space, everybody wants to work for 5, 7, 10 years and get super successful because this is what we know happens in general. This is what we expect from the success stories. But I think if you, let's say, put that aside for a little bit, the largest contribution you can bring to the ecosystem is if you create a better ecosystem or you leave a better ecosystem than the one which you found when you started being a part of it. And I think that can be only done through more and more collaboration and more meeting points of people who operate in different parts of the ecosystem. And the second part is, I hope we're aiming for more openness. If I look at the past decade and I look at the people that were in the ecosystem 10 years ago when I started slowly to be a part of it, and I look at the people which are still now part of the ecosystem, you see that the people moving different areas in building are roughly the same. In different positions, maybe because they've evolved, they've also created teams around them, which is a good thing. But I don't necessarily see a lot of fresh faces building new initiatives with a medium to long-term perspective. And I'm thinking about companies, I'm thinking about individuals who are passionate about this area and start new programs, whatever they may be, it doesn't matter. And I think for that to happen, we need to be, to attract more people from outside the ecosystem. We need to attract more leaders from different types of industries which are not necessarily connected to technology. Financial services, healthcare, those can be business builders or ecosystem builders. And I was mentioning the Romanian FinTech Association, which I think is a great example of something moving in that direction. And people in the ecosystem are pretty smart. So I'm sure I'm not only hoping, but that will also happen. I think it's a natural evolution to move everybody from their specific little box in which they've been operating to a bigger box where we start to talk frequently about what we can build together. Probably I'm going to be a bit biased here, of course, but the first thing I would single out is large-scale events and conferences. I think How to Web is one of them. I think How to Web is, at least for me, and I think also for the other people which have been a part of it in the organizing team, is like a school for understanding the ecosystem. And if I look at the people which I've worked with during those years, I think they are still part of the ecosystem, but in a variety of roles. And I think that speaks volumes about the relevance of getting people together to work for a big purpose, which is a large-scale event that happens yearly, which takes a lot of resources from you in terms of time, but also provides opportunities for collaboration. So I think large-scale events are a big accelerator. I think it's this, I would call it informal network, for lack of a better word, of people which are a message away or which you can reach out pretty easily to and can lend you a helping hand whenever the case. We're starting from the media outlets to investors to ecosystem builders. There are a lot of people who are there to help you, and I think that's really, really important. Of course, as Romanians, we still have to get a little bit past the emotion or the excitement of writing to someone, but I think that's also changing. And I think the third thing is the success stories from all areas, because I'm seeing success stories equally relevant if we're talking about the likes of UiPath, who have managed to build an industry from their company and define what can be built from here. Of course, with all the components, there's also a little bit of luck involved, but everything in life is involves a little bit of luck. But I think also the success stories like UiPath, but the success stories also like Bitdefender. And I think we have to acknowledge that when you're building a technology business, again, we all like to think about startups. We all like to think about fast growth, fast exit with a lot of multiples. The reality is there's also other trajectories of building generational businesses that withstand the test of time, that get passed on, where investors come in, they stay for a period of time, they get replaced by other investors, and the company continues evolving. And I think the success stories are really important. We have some new ones which are up and coming over the past few years. FinTech OS, Druid, more recently Sessions, Digitail, and probably there are going to be a lot more in the coming years. I think they're really relevant. I mean, they're really the best ambassadors you can have for the people in the ecosystem, the value that they bring to the table, their skills, and that's basically a gateway for other people to become part of the ecosystem and try to learn, okay, what's happening in Romania, that they're able to build such valuable companies. I think we're missing the potential. I mean, there's a lot of potential. There are a lot of good industry experts outside of technology, and I think the financial services area and healthcare are the two of the areas that come to mind, where I think there's so much expertise that if we manage to create a context where we take those people outside from their offices and get them to startup events, get them to acceleration events, get them to think, okay, what could I do better to serve the end clients of financial services, of healthcare, of other industries, we could exponentially see more valuable projects starting off. And another thing, I'm going to twist a little bit the paradigm. I think the Romanian diaspora is really important. I think there are still a lot of people who, even if they haven't left Romania in good terms because they had different needs that weren't solved here, still have an emotional, strong connection with what happens locally. And I think we should tap into that a little bit more and create these bridges between the Romanians in Romania, the Romanians in diaspora, because that could springboard the initiatives that happen from the Romanian startups, and could create the avenues to build those businesses also and expand them into those other countries. So I think that's a bridge that might be worth exploring a little bit more. I think, yeah, Romania is the land of great domain experts that don't know how great they are. I think it would be about that. It's about people that don't know how good they are, and that don't know that they're at least as good as any other people from other ecosystems, which they think highly of, and they think, okay, I'd like to be in Silicon Valley because there's more opportunity, but the quality of people professionally is as good, at least as good as a lot of other ecosystems. And I think founders should be more aware of that.